Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of how to talk policy and influence people. And today I'm joined by a very special person, Karen Treisman, Dr. Karen Treisman, who I met in Cork for training last year, if not the year before. How are you, Karen?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's so lovely to see you virtually.
Yeah, no, it's very nice to reconnect because we saw each other again at the start of 2020 before the pandemic hit.
Yes.
And now we're going to have a bit of a chat about your exciting work. But before we get into the work that you do and the books that you've been writing, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, Karen, and your background, please?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was just thinking the last time I saw you was the last face-to-face event I did, actually.
Oh, really?
Before the pandemic. So I suddenly went down a memory lane there. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I specialise in trauma, particularly relational and developmental trauma. I'm also working as an organisational consultant, so do lots of supporting lots of organisations from schools, prisons, lots of social services, domestic abuse charities, all sorts, to support them on their journey to become more trauma, adversity and culturally infused, informed and responsive. I'm an author of a few different books, and I'm a practitioner, so I work predominantly with young people who have been adopted in foster care, who are involved in youth justice services, and a lot with asylum seeking and refugee young people as well.
Okay. I always think, and don't take this the wrong way at all, but you look awfully young to have accomplished all of these amazing things, these diverse bits of expertise. And I know prior to the pandemic, you were on planes constantly and now on constant Zoom trainings and all of that. But so, Karen, why is it important, from your experience, for institutions, services, sectors to kind of tune into trauma and adversity and its impacts?
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? I suppose there's so many different ways. I think partly one of my biggest things is about not doing harm and not actually adding system trauma and being trauma inducing instead of trauma reducing. And I think unfortunately what we know is that many people within society have experienced adversity and trauma, the whole umbrella term, from cultural trauma, community trauma, intergenerational, medical trauma. And I think what we have at the moment is a lot of systems who can, usually unintentionally, add to trauma. So if we think about something like our foster care system, where people can feel like a human pinball, or when we think about some of our psychiatric systems that can see the label instead of the person, or can re-traumatize through restraint or exclusion. And so I think one of the biggest things is, how can we talk about having caring systems that actually people don't feel cared for, or are kind of dehumanizing in some ways? So I think that's one of the huge ways. But I think also, if we're trying to create healing, reparative, enriched people and societies and communities, then surely we need the organizations that educate, that serve, that support. We need, for example, like our schools to be brick parents. We need, when people are supported within social services or child welfare in America, that actually it's a place where people go to be supported and have a different way of a healing, reparative relationship, and we're listening to people rather than reenacting trauma and rendering people once again powerless and helpless. So I think that's a huge reason, but I mean there's millions of other ones.
And then why are things like gender and culture also things that systems need to tune into? Some are probably better than others for that. Maybe in the domestic violence or abuse sector, they know that there's a lot of gender-based violence, so are attuned to that. but not every sector. The criminal justice system is male dominated, and even though there are women in it. So
Yeah.
why do we need to look at gender, but also then culture as something that's important to understand and respect?
Yes, I mean, and that is, I mean, I do a 5-day training around cultural humility. So I think that's a
Wow.
massive, yeah, it's a massive,
Okay.
and I'm like, oh, how do I answer that question? But I think, firstly, I think what's often lost is the intersectionality. And I think what we know is that culture is a big umbrella term. But when we look at, you know, religion, spirituality, gender, sexuality, race, all of those different intersectionalities. And I think what happens is so often people are starting to talk more about trauma and adversity, but often they're losing it out from social justice and human rights and things like systemic oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, you can't look at one without the other because they are utterly interlinked. It's like Desmond Tutu says, you know, we need to stop just pulling people out of the river, and we
Mm-hmm.
need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And I think if you think about trauma, one of the huge things about trauma is, who is the person behind the behavior? Who is the person within the context? It's not what's wrong with you, it's
Mm.
what's happened to you. And actually, we know that we're all made up of all of these different parts of identity.
Mm.
Some are visible, some are not. Um, so I think partly there's all of those bits, but we know, for example, that in this country, if you are Black, you are more likely to be in prison. You are more likely to be in the foster care system. You're more likely to be restrained. You're more likely to be excluded from school. You're more likely to be negatively represented in the media.
Mm.
You're more likely to be living in poverty. You're more likely to have disproportionate health needs, as COVID has brought
Mm.
to the issue, like oil and water. So I think equally, it's like putting a plaster over a gaping wound if we're not actually looking at some of the wider systemic oppression. But also thinking about things like, for example, how our systems are actually created without thinking about power or privilege. But everything from, if we talk about trauma, a lot of people think about, for example, PTSD
Mm.
for veterans or domestic abuse.
Mm.
But what about cultural trauma, including racial trauma?
Mm.
What about community trauma, collective trauma?
Mm.
And then all the intergenerational, inherited, and historical trauma, the impact of, you know, colonization, slavery,
Mm.
famine, the
Mm.
troubles,
Yeah.
you know, apartheid. So I think actually we need to think about the chain of pain, but we also need to think, so there's the wider levels of that, but there's also things like on the minutiae. So for example, when I work in social services and people are talking about good enough parenting or parenting rearing
Mm.
styles, but we know there's huge different parent rearing depending on your cultural lens and the
Mm-hmm.
kaleidoscope, how you see the world, or what cultural norms are, or
Yeah.
all of those things. We know that certain symptoms, like nightmares in the Western world, is often conceptualized as a symptom of PTSD, but in many different countries, it's seen as a really important message from ancestors.
Wow.
Um,
That's interesting. Yeah.
Massively, how we
Yeah.
conceptualize it and how we see, you know, the role of spirituality. But then also thinking about the barriers of our services, like whose voices are heard, whose voices are silenced. When people say not engaging or
Mm.
hard to reach, what does that mean in terms of? So I think there's all of those bits, and then I think people are people like neat boxes, and people like simplicity, and so I think people get very, oh, you're that religion or your skin is that color, as opposed to all the nuances within that. So I think it's also, yeah, how they all come together. And then gender, obviously, as you said, with the prisons, let alone our transgender population in
Yeah.
prisons. We know around victim blaming, which obviously Jessica Taylor, Stroke Eaton's done
Mm.
lots about. We know that you're more likely to get certain diagnosis if you are female, such as personality disorder, which is a very politicized, gendered. So I think, yeah, that's just a look. I could go on, but that's
No,
just
I
some of.
understand. It was as you say, if you do a 5-day training on culture alone, it's very, very hard to pin it down. One thing that strikes me, having thought about this issue an awful lot more over the last few years, is that we have a group in Ireland called the travelling community.
Yes,
and they're a
yes.
tiny ethnic minority who have been oppressed through time. Their nomadic way of life has been more or less obliterated, very poor health outcomes, excluded from schools. People don't want them as their neighbours. A lot of embodied trauma in terms of COPD and very high suicide rates. But I'm not so sure how well our services understand the historical dimension of that trauma. Not to mention the ongoing stuff, but the fact that we used very problematic language in our official documents about them. That takes a toll, doesn't it, Karen? And does it need to be kind of faced by services that this is a thing that should never have happened?
Massively. I think not only does there need to be a huge amount of ownership, acknowledgement, and an apology, because I think actually, unless there is a sense of we recognize this, we apologize, we own it, and we're going to take action and do something about it. Absolutely. And I think I've worked with many people from Ireland, from that population, and I think it's the insidious trauma as well, isn't it? It's the look of disgust, it's the moving away, it's the laughter, it's the sniggering that people have received, the stigma, the discrimination, the othering, the societal exclusion. And then you think about the scripts and the narratives that have been passed, that chain of pain. So yeah, I think there's a huge, and what are services doing to, well, what's the government doing to apologise and take ownership, but also what shifts are being made in terms of looking at the historical impact, but also how many people from that community are being asked, what do you need? What's important to you? How have you been impacted by this? And have people leading and shaping those services? So yeah, I think there's a huge, and I think there's something about that particular population that because they are white, that sometimes actually when people are talking about segregation and people are talking about racism, they're often even more unseen and neglected and not heard. And I think actually, yeah, it's particularly for your context, very, very important that we hear those voices, really. So, yeah,
and you've a nice phrase that I think crops up as well within service provision for travellers: hostile attribution bias. Like if I'm always on the lookout for aggression and diminishing of my personhood because I'm a traveller, I'll find it very hard to believe that someone is actually there to help me. Isn't that a kind of phenomenon that is almost, efficient in a world that is a hostile world, to presume the worst?
Massively. If you have been marinated in hostility, in denigration, in humiliation, in invalidation, it makes sense that you have created a map, a kaleidoscope, a way of looking at the world that is, other people are not to be trusted, or the world is an unsafe place. And that you then are more likely to pay attention to those cues. Absolutely. And that in many likelihoods that a lot of people have learned actually, keep myself protected, do what I can to survive and navigate. Yeah, absolutely. And a sense of, we know how harmful it is to have a sense of feeling rejected or lonely or unseen or forgotten as an individual, that relational poverty, that relational starvation. But to then have it from the systems that are around you that should be there to support you, that's, at a whole other plethora of difficulties, and it's compounded because it's gone on for years and years and years and years. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a huge, it's not an area I'm hugely specialist in, people would know far more about that particular group of people than I would, but
No,
absolutely from a cultural trauma point of view.
yeah, no, I understand that entirely. But just, I suppose, for practitioners to be mindful of their own, I suppose, inherent biases sometimes, you know, because we do learn ways of thinking and judging people, unfortunately. And I suppose a key thing to forming a healthy, productive therapeutic relationship with someone is to just see them as a person, and a person with gifts, and you know, to restory, I suppose, some of the adaptations, to just try and connect as two beings in the world.
Massively. And I think knowing, as a therapist, that's one of the biggest things, isn't it? Is thinking about your own blind spots, thinking about what kaleidoscope you look at the world, owning what biases, values, the language that you use, but having humility of actually,
Yeah,
I don't know. You are the
yeah.
expert of your own experience. What is that like? So yeah, I think that's absolutely huge. And also really thinking about what might we represent to that person in front of us. You know, if that is someone who has had years of professional abuse
Mm-hmm.
and years of being excluded and silenced, you know, whether we like it or not, what you represent and the system that you might be the dominant party in. So yeah, I think there's a lot of having to be mindful of that, and yeah, think about the elephant in the room, really.
Mm. One of the things that really leapt out at me in your training was about the importance of language and being careful about how any of us really story other people, other groups, individuals, and that type of thing. And you're very sought after as a trainer, Karen. You know, you mentioned one of your 5-day trainings, the cultural one there. Can you tell me a little bit about other trainings that you offer?
Yeah, thank you for saying I'm sought after. I appreciate that. I'm very, very privileged in that way because I love it. Um, and
And you're
that's, you know,
great. You're so alive and so energetic. It's
it's a
wonderful.
gift though. Do you know, it's an amazing privilege to be able to talk about something, you know, that you love so much and you're so passionate about. So yeah, I've got loads of different trainings that I offer, and actually before it was only face to face. Now it's been a lot of virtual, and I actually have quite a lot of online modules that people can work through in their own time now, and I've got more coming out. So loads of different topics, but they all sort of go under the categories of trauma. I offer lots about understanding and awareness of the impact of trauma, particularly relational and developmental trauma, on children and adults' bodies, brains, emotions, relationships, behaviours. And there's subgroups within that, as you say, like the power of language or the impact on child development. I do lots now about organisational trauma and organisational change. How can we look at things from supervision, team meetings? How can we look at our physical environment, the language that we use, to think about it more from a lens that is informed by trauma? And then I do lots of sort of much more creative direct work. So lots of, like, I've got lots of my creative books. And
Yeah,
so
they're amazing too.
thank you. And so I do, for example, creative ways of working with children around self-esteem and strengths, or creative ways around emotional regulation, or how to support transition from foster to adoption, or how to help children learn about or identify feelings. So lots and lots of and lots also around sort of secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, staff well-being, staff wellness. Yeah, so those sorts of things to lots of people. So from social services is the main arena that I work in, but health, the courts, education, foster carers, adopters, residential, the public. So yeah.
Super. Thank you, Karen. And you wrote a new book that I think is going to be published shortly, maybe early in the new year, called A Treasure Box for Creating Trauma-Informed Organizations, a ready-to-use resource for trauma, adversity, and culturally informed, infused, and responsive systems. It's a long title, but a really good one.
As you were reading it, I was like, I never remember what it was called, but thank you.
Yeah. No, it covers the gamut, I think. What prompted you to write it, Karen?
I have to say, you know, this is my, well, it's 11th and 12th book, because it comes in 2 volumes, and it is
You
the
never
book.
sleep, clearly, Karen.
I don't sleep very much, but I'm probably the most excited and most anxious about these books than any other project. I feel like, yeah, it's been a real work of blood, sweat and tears. Why I wrote it was lots of reasons. So partly I was very, as you know, very sort of fed up with trauma informed being used as a tokenistic term, as a buzzword, as we're going to put a fruit bowl in our reception area and we're trauma informed, or we're going to do an ACE screening and we're trauma informed, we're going to change our website, we're trauma informed. And I really wanted to help people start to look at what does that actually mean and look like from meaningful change. And I was incredibly lucky that I was awarded the Winston Churchill Fellowship, and I got to go to America. I had met over 100 people. It was one of the most phenomenal experiences. Traveled to 14 cities across East and West America, and was learning from the trailblazers, from amazing organizations. What does it mean to you? What does it look like? And I basically wanted to collate that. But what I wanted to do is, a lot of people have done the awareness training now, so they've got an idea of what trauma is, but a lot of people are like, but what next? What do we do? How do we actually action this? And a lot of that is therapeutic, but I wanted to look at organizations. How can we create systems that are trauma reducing? How can we look at our local authorities becoming brick parents, becoming secure bases and safe haven? How are we looking at how we do assessments, how we do team meetings, at the language that we use? How are we thinking about co-production? And then there's all these values of trauma-informed practice, you know, safety or collaboration, transparency, but they're words. So I wanted to have a chapter on each value with actually reflective practice exercises with questions. And then I got over 40 different contributors from Africa, Asia, America, Australia, Ireland, Northern Ireland, etc. That what does this look like for a surgeon? What does this look like for a dentist? What does this look like?
Cool.
And collate it, but with my artist eye. So in there's over 100 different infographics. There's worksheets. It's photocopyable, so people can take it on their away days, take it to supervision. So I wanted it to be like my therapeutic treasure box that people love because it's practical and creative and tangible, but for organizations and systems. So that's a little bit.
Yeah, no, it sounds very impressive. So it's clearly oriented then at people who are working within organizations and systems.
Yeah, it is. There's definitely stuff that any practitioner or any person could use, but my focus was, if you're working as a GP, if you're working as a policeman, if you're working as a teacher, how can we look at some of the system change? So yes, whilst there's chapters that are about language, which is for everyone, or hope, or your own well-being, some of the stuff that's around, team meetings, supervision, recruitment, induction, training, that's more for organisations.
And from all your work that you've done and the various systems that you've engaged with and services, is it fair to say that a lot of them are actually quite traumatized themselves? You know, the actual sectors or the services, that there's a lot of almost sickness within it, or stress and tension, and particularly I would think the criminal justice system in general is not one that is prone to promoting relational kindness necessarily as a massive value, or physical or emotional safety. It wouldn't even know what it meant. It would be too touchy-feely, and choice or voice, maybe restorative justice, but the mainstream not so much. And even healthcare, you know, is not very tuned into mind-body unity, or that what we say can hurt in a vicious wound and linger on. So are many of the systems actually really in kind of dire need of taking a good hard look at themselves?
Massive. I would say the vast majority. I think particularly when you look at systems like social services, prisons, the health system. I've got a report coming out probably over this Christmas about trauma-inducing health experiences. I put a tweet out. I got over 390 reports in one day.
Not surprised.
So
sadly.
Yeah. Sadly, and unfortunately with COVID and for us with Brexit, I think we've already got an incredibly polarised kind of system that's been added. So to answer your question, yes, I think that most of those systems are incredibly traumatized and traumatizing. I think they have their own survival modes. They are marinated in trauma. They are unhealthy. As Sandy Bloom says, they are organized around trauma. So yes, and I think what we see, so many of these patterns, things like crushed empathy, dehumanize, going into shutdown mode, attacking each other. So yes, I think that we have systems that inevitably, because they're marinated in social injustice and human rights violations and trauma, we have systems that are unwell. And then if you are a traumatized system trying to support families, for example, in need, that's not modeling the model. And actually, if you're in survival mode, it's very hard to help others. You know, if you're reactive, it's hard to reflect. So yes, I think a lot of systems need to get their own ducks in a row, but also look at things like, why do we have such bad staff sickness, staff absences, staff retention, staff satisfaction, disciplinary issues, conflict, all of those things? I think absolutely systems need to look at themselves, and that's what the books are for, and really think about what can we do to align with the values. What can we do that they're not just collecting dust on a shelf, but they actually are infused and embodied in how we do things. And I think, you know, because you've heard me say it a million times, my favorite quote from Maya Angelou, you know, people will forget what you do and forget what you say, but they will remember how you make them feel. And I think if we think about some of our systems, if the walls could talk, what would they say? How do they make people feel? Are they helpful, healing, reparative systems, or are they ones that unintentionally, most of the time, add harm? So,
and also, though, even within those systems, or within even the private sector workplace too, to a degree, the way we speak to one another, you know, the harmful judgments and the kind of and the difficulties that if someone, let's say, has a mental health issue, the snide behaviors and the kind of the lack of support, when what we need is support and understanding to have good health and well-being. It's kind of, it's a very big issue, I think.
It's massive. And also that feeds into a different issue of also othering and polarizing and splitting. And I think I always feel incredibly uncomfortable within, if you listen to sort of what's said, take it in a social service office in a derogatory way about a parent, for example. How do you know that your colleague
well, indeed,
like that, or isn't struggling with that, or doesn't have a sister in that position, or wasn't that child? So I think there's a huge thing about not us and them, that how do we, and that's one of the big things about trauma informed, isn't it, is that you take a universal approach, and so you tread gently.
Yes, it's all of us.
Yes, it's not a them and us. And I think that's really, really important. But also you have to care for the carer, you have to contain the container. And it's that whole sense of, you know, how can you be mindful if your minds are full? And so I think absolutely we have to create healthy workforces that can then support. And we have an ethical responsibility to do that.
One thing as well on modeling the model, I was discussing with Rick Kelly from Canada recently about how some people just seem to have an inability to be able to apologize for anything that they do. And we all make mistakes, we all mess up, we can be cruel, we can be unthinking, and it's so important, isn't it, Karen, that we repair the relational breaches. You've the lovely phrase, relational rupture requires relational repair. And that's not just about attachment, that's any relational repair or rupture, isn't it?
Massive. And I think we all cock up all the
Mm,
time. We're all human, and we only can do things, and at the moment when people's window of tolerance, most people's window of tolerance is narrow, I've been snappier and more moody and more this. And also, I look back at court reports I wrote a few years ago and think, oh God, why did I use that language? Or, absolutely. So I think it's such a powerful thing to be able to take ownership and say, I'm sorry,
mhm,
and to be able to absolutely do that relational repair, or now I know this, I do this differently, or if I could go back, or take some
mm,
accountability. But also, how can we, if we're not able to do that, for example, with our foster carers, our adopters, children, we're not modeling the model for them to be
or
able to
not.
do that. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's huge that people fit, and it's the same with language.
Mm,
I do my power of language workshop. I've got the online module on it coming out, but there's times when I'll slip and say something and think, oh, why did I say that? Or we're human, it's
mm.
okay. We go back and we do
And try and
we
make amends. Yeah.
exactly make amends. And actually that is such a powerful tool, isn't it? To be able to show someone kind of humility and to be able to say, I'm sorry.
Mm.
That wasn't my intention.
And I think for, say, young people in conflict with the law who've done harmful things and maybe had serious harms done to them, to have
Yeah.
someone in an authority position say, I was wrong there. I shouldn't have said that. I snapped at you. I'm very sorry. Can we start again? Can you forgive me? How powerful would that be?
So powerful.
Yeah.
And I think with trauma, particularly trauma, as we know, is a boundary violation, it's a dignity violation, it's an integrity violation, it's a moral injury. And so to have someone be able to come and say, it's that human rights non-active provokes, that wasn't okay what happened to
Yeah.
you, like not okay, not acceptable, was a violation. That's a huge thing for someone to be able to hear, to feel seen and heard and validated, which is what most of us want in the
Mm.
world. So yeah.
And maybe as well, it kind of stops that pattern of traumatic reenactment, where everyone harms everyone all the time and no one says sorry and there's no repair. That if suddenly there's a change, that
Yeah.
that can set other little things into motion, by just disrupting the script.
Yeah, I think so. And it fits in with this growth mindset. I
Mm,
think so many people, and trauma can feed into this, can give a very rigid, fixed mindset, my way or the
mm,
highway. And we see that in organizations all the time. We've done this for 20 years. This is, we're not changing. But I think also to be able to say sorry, it fills in with that. And I'm willing and open to learn, to develop, to move forward,
mhm.
which then sets that tone. So yeah, I think it's so important.
One of the newer areas that I've started getting into lately is more along the lines of trying to heal community trauma, or looking at the role of neighborhoods and little small places in both preventing trauma from happening in the first place by, supporting families and moms and little kids, but also then coming around and holding people when it does happen. So do you have any views on this? Do you think it's an important area to kind of develop?
Huge. I mean, beyond huge. Yeah. I mean, as it takes a village to raise a
Mhm.
child, and I always think it takes a village to raise a person, not just
Yes.
a child.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think Bruce Perry talks about relational health, social connectedness. It's huge, and I think we know that feeling a sense of belonging, of togetherness, of grassroots movements, and you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. We can create therapeutic communities where people feel held and together. And so yeah, absolutely. Do I think that as a replacement for some of the other stuff? No, I think we need both,
Hmm.
and I don't think it should be polarized. But yeah, I mean, I've been so lucky, and I don't want to get emotional talking about in the pandemic because obviously I can't get on a plane, but obviously I've spent a lot of time in different countries. And I think, you know, the year before last, I was in Ghana, Togo, Benin, the Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, looking at voodoo practices and the power and the beauty of healing through voodoo practices. When I was in
Okay.
China and India, I was looking at things through Tai Chi and yoga. You know, when I've been in places that are looking at drumming and the use of art, and lots of local healers and spiritual healers. And when I was in Rwanda, I got to go to some of the Gacaca trials, which was like the Truth and Reconciliation. So I think absolutely there is a power of that community, and bringing together. But also when we think about things like stigma and like social exclusion, one of the hugest ways that's going to be is within the communities that we function within. So yeah, I think there's a massive sense of how we bring that back into the community and mobilize it. And one of the things, my favorite things on my Winston Churchill fellowship, was when I went to Philadelphia, and there's a project there called the Mural Arts Project. It's amazing. And they've got a subgroup called Porchlight, which you would love. They go into prisons, they go into psychiatric hospitals, they work with people who are living on the streets, who are homeless, and they create these unbelievable collective community murals.
Nice.
But they do it over a period of 18 months. So it's through really talking about the themes, the ideas, coming together, rituals. And then when they actually do the mural, they all come as a community and they paint, it's all the fabric together, and then they put it up. And it's so interesting because I don't quote me on the number, but they've got about over 300 in Philadelphia, which is quite a small city. And I believe none or like one has been graffitied in the over 20 years since they've
That's
been.
something.
Which is something. And there's something about walking around those streets and looking around, and the messages that you just get from the buildings about social justice. Around, they did one over a bridge where there was lots of suicides, of a beacon of hope to try, that was the thing that people saw. And I think there's something about also, and even things like, you know, here we have our soaps, people, if they're watching it elsewhere, will think, what am I talking about? Like EastEnders and Emmerdale. You know, if they did good storylines, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, about actually getting messages into the public. Or what about our parenting classes when you're pregnant? You know, if you were embraced and learned about brain development and learned about relational connectedness. So yeah, I think there's a huge spiritual leaders, and yeah, lots and lots that
I read a lovely article actually, speaking about pregnancy and parenting. It was an article from Kenya about baby showers through the lens of Ubuntu and Boto. So they were looking at it as a gendered event, but also a way of supporting urban moms who really didn't have any connections and were going to be single parents. And so to celebrate them, you know, have a little party for them, but in advance of the baby, so that they could impart bits of information and knowledge about, you know, what it's going to be like, and that babies need hugs, I guess. And, you know, you can't hug them too much. I don't really know what they were saying, but I thought, what a great idea, you know,
I think
for all communities.
Absolutely. There's so, and each community will have their own way of connecting and making sense, and what's important and how they communicate that. And I think for those communities to harness those messages and find different ways that work and connect for them, it's like, if you take the tree of life, you know, which is one of my favorite therapeutic tools from narrative therapy from Nakazela. And, you know, that was adapted, for example, in Afghanistan to the kite of life.
Okay.
You know, and I think it's those, and that was from a community grassroots up. And I think absolutely it's how these things resonate and make sense for those particular people in that place. And that's like in testimonial psychotherapy, you know, it was adapted in Thailand to include Buddhist monks, for example, in the process. So yeah, I think there's so many different aspects of mobilizing communities and yeah, and supporting people's voices to be sort of celebrated and heard. Yeah.
And it seems that really, in some ways, a lot of the effective practices for sort of processing trauma come from Indigenous cultures that have often been sidelined, by the West and by white men oftentimes, or white people in general. But, you mentioned the drumming and singing and dancing and rhythmic stuff coming together in the collective seems to be just so positive for the human spirit.
Huge, yeah. And a lot of my own experiences, I've taken part in voodoo ceremonies. I've been to see many sangomas, traditional healers. I think in terms of the drumming, did crystal healing in India, and as a clinical psychologist, people are often like, "Ooh, that's very out there," and but actually, yes, I think there is a huge amount about how we can integrate the mind, body, the spiritual world, and all those different paths of healing and connection and meaning making and sense making. So, yeah, I think there's something massively beautiful about that. Yeah.
And have you seen on your travels examples of very wounded communities actually self-healing in various ways, Karen?
Yeah, massively. I mean, I suppose Rwanda being one of the ones, but yeah, many different ones: Mozambique, South Africa, Ethiopia, so China, India. Yes, lots and lots of different examples. Would I say, that they were of the journey? No, because it's an ongoing journey. But had I seen, particularly in Rwanda, some amazing examples through using the arts, using theatre, using psychodrama, finding ways to sort of have circles of support. In fact, Me Too, obviously the Me Too movement, Me Too was spoken about long before. They had Me Too rooms in Rwanda. They had Me Too rooms in Burkina Faso. They had Me Too rooms
very interesting.
in Burundi that was massively about sharing and naming and talking about it. But yes, absolutely lots in terms of drumming, in terms of community rituals. So yes, I think I've seen lots of those aspects in various different ways throughout that, which I think, yeah, is beautiful, but it's pockets, I suppose, as opposed to from a government level. Yeah.
And am I right that you grew up in Africa, Karen?
I spent lots of periods,
lots of different countries. And because the reason I asked that is I recall in one of the trainings, I can't remember which one, where you were talking about how for anyone really working with people with trauma histories, how it's important to reflect on one's own triggers. And you mentioned that racism was something that particularly was activating for you.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, given the year again that we've had with some very kind of distressing, but also exciting in a way and moving things coming out of America, the George Floyd killing and many other killings at the hands of police, the filming of it, the huge protests in America and beyond. Are you hopeful that these type of movements, and I suppose as well, a lot of it is about white people finally seeing, because they can't deny it, what Black people have known all along, have been living with this type of threat and being diminished. Are you hopeful that there might be some enduring change?
It's a really tricky one. Am I hopeful? Absolutely. I'm always hopeful. And I think there is phenomenal change and progress in so many different areas. And I think if we look at that, even from, people used to smoke inside and no one could imagine there was a change, and people used to not wear their seatbelts. And now, so am I hopeful for change? Absolutely. Am I incredibly sad that it took that to mobilize a lot of people, when you would hope that this would be something that people would have been thinking about long before George Floyd and Black Lives Matter? Do I feel that it's mobilized something and that there's a lot more people who seem to be thinking, reflecting, learning, being more proactive and thinking about white privilege, white fragility. Yes, I think that's super exciting. I think it's now, there are, you said it, you know, people can't deny. I think people are still denying.
Oh, right, okay.
So I think that's tricky. I think that what's hard is to keep the momentum and to keep the buzz. And I think there's a lot of people, and I'm sure, you know, I'm not saying othering, because I'm sure I can be included in that as well, that things go and it becomes the focus and then it goes again. And I think, so I think there's going to be something really important about thinking about how is that mobilized? How does the talk get translated into doing and action and being proactive? But do I think that it's been exciting to see lots more spaces being created, lots more people who are in my world who maybe didn't think like that, who have started questioning it? Yes, but I think there's a whole lot more to be done, and I think that it's COVID, whilst in some ways COVID has really crystallized so many of these things, which is amazing, I also think a lot of people are struggling to really think beyond, or really absorb or action things, because a lot of people, including myself at different points, have been in autopilot, in survival mode, you know, window of tolerance. And so I just hope that once things start to settle a little bit, that people will really, myself included, really continue committing and mobilizing and acting more than just words.
And I suppose one of the dangers, or the, like, alongside this great, though sad movement, is the fact that Donald Trump, you know, wasn't defeated by a massive margin on a very racist platform. And also that the sitting UK government, a lot of its policies were very anti-immigrant and frankly, one might say racist, or certainly not treasuring Black and brown bodies, you know. So there's an awful lot of racist sentiment in the world. So obviously those people would be denying that these are issues to be addressed.
Absolutely, it's rife. It's absolutely rife. And I think, and even people who do feel really passionate, I think can feel overwhelmed with other things, or paralyzed with what do I do, or there's lots of attacking from other ways. So yes. So am I hopeful? Always. Do I think there's a whole lot more to be done? Yes.
Absolutely. Well, I agree with you there. One thing, I was speaking to this lovely woman who, she's originally from Nigeria, living in Ireland, Dr. Eben Joseph. I interviewed her a while back. And one thing she said was that people of African origin in Ireland need allies. And if they're being diminished or abused, they need people to defend them at that point, and say, this is not okay, rather than kind of just standing there with an open mouth, uncomfortable and silent. Do you think we need to do more of that? And is it within our power to do more of that as onlookers?
Absolutely. I think we can't be passive recipients. We need to be able to be social activists. We need to be active agents of change. I think we need to be hopeful disruptors. It's bloody hard to do sometimes, but it's harder to live it. I can't remember who said the quote of, you know, if you have to learn about racism, you're privileged because you're not living it. You know, and I think that's, so yes, I absolutely, I think people need to be able to speak up and say, and gently find ways to challenge people and to bring different alternatives in. So yeah, very much so. I think that's you know, silence is a powerful tool in itself. So yes, I think it's really important to bring those discourses in where people can and where people feel able to, and the change has to come, you know, has to come from white people. It has to come from the dominant discourse, and that doesn't mean it's, but you know, actually thinking about those processes that are adding to the systemic oppression.
Yeah, Eben was just saying that it takes the shame from the person who's having the racial wound in that moment, you know, and because otherwise it's all on them and they're defenseless. Whereas if someone says that's not okay to say, it somehow lifts it off them, or they're not alone in it, I guess.
Yeah,
A
very
bit of
much so.
solidarity.
It reminds me of that famous poem, during the war, first they came for the socialists, um, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't socialist. And then they came
Yes.
for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist.
Yeah.
Then they came for the Jews, I didn't speak up
Yeah.
because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up for me.
And it's so true. We don't always think about it in those terms, that we really should behave as we would like to be treated at the very basic level, do unto others, as you would like to be done unto you.
Yeah, and my grandparents were, from the Holocaust in Germany, and I think that's been a very shaping experience of persecution, and I've experienced lots of anti-Semitism in various ways, even though I'm not practicing.
Right.
But I've had some
Wow.
really horrible experiences, and I think there's something about that those areas of discrimination or crushing or dehumanizing, they cross over. We see it for our LGBTQI community. And we were talking about intersectionality before. If you identify as being from the LGBTQI community, and also you identify as being Muslim, and you also identify and you're in a wheelchair, all these different intersectionalities, and then what that means to you and how that might be similar or different to how other people see you. So yeah, it's complex, but certainly one that I think needs more reflection and thinking, and the richness of people's tapestries of their life.
The one nice thing, though, is that, well, I suppose it's a blessing and a curse. A lot of it is within our hands, especially as parents. And my children are far more open-minded and accepting, I think, than I would have been at their age, just because attitudes have shifted, and I suppose we are all works in progress. And just because we've had ignorant views in the past doesn't mean we can't, with information and getting to know people, and getting to know that people are as human as ourselves, that we maybe need to toss some of these attitudes and ideas in the bin. I've just one more for you, Karen, because you've been very generous with your time. I recently started on a youth justice project, and I'm interested in getting your kind of clinical experience with youngsters who might be very hostile and aggressive and seemingly entrenched in really harmful antisocial criminal behaviors. What way do you think clinicians, or just really anyone in a professional role engaging with these kind of young people needs to attend to, or what advice would you give them?
It's hard because there's so much there, and I do whole trainings on that, but I think a few pockets. I think firstly, to see the person behind the behavior, and not see the person as a behavior. I think, to me, some of the narrative therapy, Michael White stuff, the problem is the problem, not the person. It's not your anger, it's the anger. So I think that is thinking anger is a bodyguard emotion, anger is a mask, camouflage emotion. It's, as we know, generally married to pain, fear, shame, sadness. People learn better to be mad than sad, better to attack than be attacked. So I think how we can help understand that, but how we help to honour why the fences are up in the first place. How can we acknowledge why those feelings have had to be developed, why someone has had to protect themselves in that way. I think helping people to have a different experience of doing relationships and being in relationships, and actually, for many children, you learn the world shit on you, so you shit on the world, and you can understand that in that sense. So I think giving young people a sense of seeing them, trying to understand what the anger or the aggression is trying to communicate. And I think there has to be co-regulation. We can't do self-regulation without co-regulation. So how are we using ourselves and the relationship to teach some of those skills, to show someone empathy? Someone doesn't just learn empathy, they experience it, they learn it, they have all those micro moments. and then you have to treat people how you want to teach them. So I think so often these young people are seen as criminals and bad blood and all of those things. So I think how we can see the person, and I would say lots of how can we be curious instead of furious? I think lots of those emotional regulation, co-regulation, and that whole it's not what is wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. But so much more, but hopefully
there is. Well, I mean, I think anyone who might be watching this would say, oh, she's covered so much there, and there are all these trainings to be doing. But I imagine that getting that information for a youth justice worker could be really, really useful to kind of go, oh my goodness, this brutalized young boy, it's no wonder he's all prickly and volatile. He's trying to repel me to keep himself safe. That's a complete mind flip.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's a fundamental shift. And it's a bit like I always say on my trainings, it's like an optical illusion. Often you can't see the other side. And once you see it, you're like, I can't unsee it, because I suddenly see all this person within the landscape of their life experiences. I suddenly see the hurt boy hidden amongst the knife or the gun or the layers. And I suddenly feel invested to make a difference. And I don't want to be another abandoning, exploitative, rejecting adult. I want to support that relational trauma requires relational repair.
And that's, I guess, why it's very important that trauma-informed or trauma-responsive is not just a fad or something fashionable or a one-day training that you can then say, we've done it, we're going back to normal.
Huge. And it's so much more than that. There are key values. It is about embodying it. It's about feeling it. It's about walking the walk. It's about and it's about embedding. Training is one teeny step. It's then, how do we see this in our culture, in our language, in our policies, in our practice? How do we feel? All of those bits. And then even if you do training, how is it embedded? How is it infused? How is it shown in reflective practice, in team meetings and supervision? Absolutely. And how do we do it with the team around us, not just with the people? So it's so much more than just training.
I'm going to let you go now, Karen, but is there any aspect of public policy that you would like to see shift in the UK at the moment?
Let's get the government changed first.
Right, okay.
I mean, everything.
Right, okay.
I mean, my sort of, if I had to start with somewhere first, and this is very much my own bias, I will completely re-envision and restructure social services to be trauma informed. I'd also massively invest in parenting, early years, pregnancy, midwifery, health visitors, to really start to think about some of those intergenerational changes rather than waiting till the other end. But everything, I think our education system needs to be completely changed. I think our prison system needs to be completely changed. I think that we need people who actually are experiencing lived and living experiences to be at the absolute front. Poverty, I mean,
there's lots. There's lots to be tackled, Karen. There's lots.
We've got a lot of work to do, but hopeful disruptors will keep going.
We will indeed. Look, Dr. Karen Treisman, it was an absolute delight. Really lovely seeing you and, drinking in your wise words and your positivity and your energy. I could even feel it through the interweb. So it was great. And I wish you all the best with your book. I can't wait to see it and read it, and hopefully meet again in real life before too terribly long. So
I so hope so. Thank you for having me. Thank you for creating the platform and for all your amazing work as well. I really appreciate it. And sending virtual hugs, and I hope it will be in person
right back
again.
at you. This has been How to Talk Policy and Influence People, folks, with Dr. Karen Treisman. Happy Christmas to one and all. Bye now.